Hello, welcome back to Bioclass Bytes. In this video, we are going to talk about energy flow in an ecosystem. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and like and share this video. In the previous video, we've talked about cells and cellular processes wherein the flow and transfer of energy occur. So we've talked about photosynthesis and cellular respiration, and we saw how photosynthetic organisms are capable of harnessing solar energy and converting it into chemical energy and storing those energy in the chemical bonds of glucose molecules. We've also talked about how animals and other heterotrophs are capable of performing cellular respiration in their mitochondria, wherein they break down glucose molecules in order to harvest that ATP or adenosine triphosphate molecule that will enable them to perform metabolic processes. In this video, so those are all energy transformation at cellular level. But in this video, we are going to talk about energy transfer in organism, population, and ecosystem levels. So we've established that the energy transfer in an ecosystem flows in one direction. And for population and ecosystem level, the best way to visualize that is by looking at a food chain and its possible a bigger interweaving or bigger interrelations in a food web. So a food chain shows how energy flows from one organism to another in an ecosystem. We have established that the beginning of all energy flow is the sun, and producers or photosynthetic organisms are able to capture that. And then once they're eaten, the next flow of energy will be towards the consumers. And this path is considered linear or in just one direction as the energy is transferred to the next organism. So the start of every food chain would be the sun. So a food chain starts with the sun, then it's followed by the producers who are capable of photosynthesis. And then those producers are eaten by your primary consumers, which are always herbivores. So primary first. First consumers, which are always herbivores, because they are the ones who they are most of their all their diet are mostly composed of plants and algae. So once those so in this example, those are grasshoppers. So once those grasshoppers are eaten by the next consumer, such as your frog here, then the energy is transferred to the next organism, and your frogs are considered your secondary consumers. So once your frogs are eaten by the next organism, such as the snake here, then they are considered the tertiary consumers, and then the energy is transferred to the snake. Okay? So just a question, what do you think would be the next step in this food chain? So the tertiary consumers are your snake. So can you think of other organisms in which the snakes are part of their diet? Well, my answer would be the honey badgers. They are one of my favorite organisms. Honey badgers eat snakes, sometimes even venomous snakes, as part of their diet. Okay, so that could be the next step of the food chain. Food web, on the other hand, is a more complicated, overlapping, interwoven food chains. Okay, it represents the interconnected food chains within an ecosystem. All of the food chains with their interconnections make up a food web. So a food chain is just a linear representation, a linear model. A food web, as the name implies, it has several of these branching outs. So the arrows in a food chain and in a food web indicate the direction of the energy transfer. So the arrow here shows us the energy transfer, which organism will receive the energy. Okay, to whom will the energy be transferred? So in a food chain, it's very easy to visualize, but in a food web, you really have to look carefully. So for example, this is your producer, then this is the first primary consumer, then that primary consumer can be eaten by this next consumer, or it can be eaten by this consumer and then by this consumer. So the arrow points to us the direction of energy transfer, who eats who. Okay, so that's an example of a food web. So these are the things you have to remember whenever we talk about food chains and food webs. Producers, usually represented by letter P, these are your photosynthetic organisms like plants and algae. They are called producers because they are the ones who introduce, or they are the ones who harness energy, the unusable solar energy, and convert it into glucose and store it in their body. And once they're eaten, they're the ones who pass on the energy, the chemical energy, to the next organism. So producers are always photosynthetic organisms. Consumers, on the other hand, they cannot make their own food. And producers are also called autotrophs. Auto, then troph. It means that troph means feeding or to feed. So they can feed themselves. Auto, self, they can feed themselves. Consumers, on the other hand, cannot make their own food. Therefore, they depend on other organisms for survival. So they feed on other organisms. And they are called also heterotrophs. Hetero means others. So they feed on other organisms. Decomposers, on the other hand, they break down dead organisms to recycle their nutrients. Okay, so they feed on decaying matter, they feed on the dead organisms to recycle the nutrients. So these are mostly your decomposing bacteria. So let's consider this food web and see how many food chains are interwoven or interconnected in this example. Okay, so one of your food chain could be the start with that could start with the pine tree. So that's your producer. So of course the start of every food chain would be the sun. Okay, so it's understood, it's established. And then through photosynthesis, the pine tree will harvest energy from the sun. Okay, and then pine can be eaten by an insect. So with this arrow, with an insect called pine borer, making it the primary consumer. So C1, it usually means primary consumer. Okay, so first consumer or primary consumer. And all first or primary consumers are always herbivores because they eat plants or plant parts. Then your pine borer can be eaten by the golden crown kinglet. That's a type of bird. So making it the secondary consumer. Okay. So all secondary consumers are carnivores, okay, because they feed on herbivores. Then your kinglet can be eaten by the snake, making it the tertiary consumer. So you can see the number 1, 2, 3, or 1. Primary consumer, secondary consumer, tertiary consumer. Okay? So your snake um, will eventually die. Okay? Your snake will eventually die. And then the action will now be done by the decomposers or decomposing bacteria. So um, all of these members from pine to pine borer to kinglet to snake, all of them will eventually die. So when they die, it will now be the time. It will be the time for the decomposing bacteria or even some fungi to recycle their nutrients to return them to the soil. So this one is one food chain. Okay. Then in an ecosystem, you can have two or more or several producers. So in this case, the other producer would be the oak tree. So this is one food chain, but we also have another one here on this side. So the oak tree is your producer. Then it can be eaten by the mouse, making it the primary consumer and also an herbivore. Then the mouse can either be eaten by the snake or making the snake the secondary consumer. So it has two roles in an ecosystem. Then the mouse can also be eaten by the red-tailed hawk, making it the secondary consumer. So if there's another another food chain within that ecosystem. So it's now no longer called a food chain but a food web, wherein you have several types of producers, several types or species of primary consumers, secondary consumers, and several types of tertiary consumers. But please note that all of them will eventually die, and as they die, they will be decomposed, and their nutrients will be recycled by your decomposing bacteria and fungi. Now, side note, I hope you also understand that the more members of the food web there are, the more stable the food web is. It means that the more numerous your number of producers are, or the kind of producers are, the more stable the ecosystem is. How do I say that? If something happens to the pine, if a forest fire just happened to burn all this side of pines, and they are the only producers in that ecosystem, what will happen to the primary consumers? If all the primary consumers will die because they have no pine to eat, what will happen to the secondary, to the kinglets, to the snakes? The ecosystem will crumble. So it's better if we have two types of producers, so that if something happens to this producer, you still have another producer to sustain the ecosystem. So the idea is to have high biodiversity. When we say biodiversity, those are the different, diverse, biodiversity, different kinds of species in an ecosystem. So what we want is a high biodiversity. If we have 10 types of producers, better. 20 types of primary consumers, better. So that even if this pine borer becomes extinct or they become wiped out, you still have other primary consumers in the ecosystem. Even if something happens to the red-tailed hawk or something happened to the kinglet, we have other secondary consumers, the ecosystem will survive. This is why we need to protect our natural environment, our natural resources. Because even if you just remove one species, everything that it eats and everything that eats it will be affected. Okay? And even if you add another organism here, for example, an organism that does not belong here, for example, a cheetah does not belong here, it can actually disrupt this entire ecosystem because it might start feeding on the mouse, then all the mice will become extinct. So what will happen to all those who depend on the mice for food? They will also be endangered. So this is the reason why we need to protect the diversity, the biodiversity of all our ecosystems, of the entire biosphere, because each and every one of these organisms are interdependent with each other. You remove one, everything crumbles down, especially if it is actually quite a small ecosystem. So what we need is to have more producers, numerous types of producers, numerous types of consumers, numerous types of decomposers, just to make it a more stable ecosystem. Another side note, humans are actually considered lucky because we have taken ourselves out of the food chain. Do you think we are still part of the food chain? Are we still hunting for food? Are we still in fear of another organism that might consume us or eat us or run after us and then eat our babies? Not anymore. Humans have long removed themselves from the food chain. We have learned how to do agriculture and poultry and animal husbandry. We have, instead of looking for them and hunting for them in the wild, we have created croplands. We have created ranches wherein we domesticated these organisms, and this instead of hunting for food, we are now growing our food in our farms. So humans, we really find it difficult to relate to other species because we have taken ourselves out of the food chain. But if you are part of the food chain and you see how important it is that other organisms also survive, then the more you appreciate the interdependence of organisms in an ecosystem. We will tackle more about it in, I think it's on Unit 6, Interactions and Interdependence in an Ecosystem. So again, to define, a food chain is a community. So it's different species, different groups, different population of organisms where each member is eaten in turn by another member. A food web, on the other hand, is a community of organisms where there are several interrelated food chains. Food chain, only one direction. Food web, interweaving, interwoven food chains. Food chains and food webs are representations of the predator-prey relationship between species in an ecosystem or habitat. So, predator-prey. So, primary consumers are mostly prey, while secondary to tertiary consumers are mostly predators. So what we've seen here is a terrestrial ecosystem. This is an example of an aquatic ecosystem. So here, your primary consumers are your, um, what do we call this? Your algae and diatoms. Okay? So they're the ones that perform photosynthesis. Then they can be eaten by your shrimp-like creatures. Then fish can also eat both of them, while smaller fish can be eaten by mackerel, and then tuna may be eating those smaller mackerel, and then a bigger predator like a shark could eat also these smaller organisms. So we also have food webs in aquatic environments. So another example of a terrestrial food chain, so you have your plants here as the primary, as the producers, then these are your um, primary consumers. So both are herbivores. So all primary consumers are herbivores. Okay. Then they can be eaten by a wolf or a snake or other larger insects. So they are considered your secondary consumers. Then your secondary consumers can then be eaten by a large predator such as an eagle or an owl. So if nothing eats them anymore, if nothing follows after them, they are called top predators or apex predators. Okay, it means they are top of the food chain. Nobody eats them or hunts them anymore. So they are tertiary consumers. In some food webs, they can have up to quaternary producers. Okay, so that they have another level or another group of consumers. Okay. So do not forget that all of these creatures will eventually die, and then that will be the action of the decomposers. So when all of these die, earthworms, bacteria, and fungi will decompose their body and recycle the nutrients and return them to the soil to be used by the plants, but to be used by the producers. So let's try to answer this pop quiz. Very easy. So the arrows in a food chain represent the flow of energy. A food chain starts with an energy source. And most of the time, almost all of the time, it's the sun. Sun is the start or the energy source in almost all food chains. Organisms that make their own food are called autotrophs or producers. So auto means self, troph means to feed, self-feeding. They can feed themselves. Okay? So plants use their own food to perform metabolic processes. Organisms that eat plants are called herbivores or primary consumers. An animal with no natural enemy is a top or apex predator. Apex, that's the tip of the pyramid or the tip of the triangle. So if this is the triangle, apex predator. Okay. So the next part of the lesson is energy pyramid. So an energy pyramid is similar to food web. However, the organisms are arranged by their trophic levels. Okay, so it follows a pyramidal shape because the pyramid or the levels within the pyramid refers to the number of organisms, the numbers of organism per trophic level, as well as the amount of energy transferred from one level to another. So as you can see here in this example, okay, so we have used this food web as the example. Okay, so here The producers are always found at the base of the pyramid. One, because they are the most numerous organisms. So if you consider one rooted grass as one individual, and then in an ecosystem, if you count all of those individual grass, rooted grass, then they are actually they outnumber the rest of the community or the rest of the ecosystem. So they are mostly the biggest in number. Ideally, that's the idea. Right? They should have the most numerous population, and they should be the one harvesting the most energy from the sun. Now, the next level, as you can see by the arrow, the next level is when these grasses are eaten by the rabbits as primary consumers. But as you notice, it's not a rectangle, it's not equal. As you go higher the trophic level, the number of population or the population of organisms decreases as well as the energy being transferred. We will talk more about that as we go along. So once your primary consumers have eaten the producers, then in turn they will be eaten by the secondary consumers, the snakes in this example. So the energy will now be transferred to the next trophic level. Trophic, Trophic, trophic level, your snakes. So as you can see here, if this is the primary consumers, the next level is even smaller. It means that they should have fewer secondary consumers. So from thousands of grasses up to then into 4 rabbits, now into 2 snakes. Then the apex predator, the tip of the last level, the last trophic level, are your tertiary consumers. For example, the hawk here or the eagle here. So there's only one, okay, making it the smallest population. That's why they have the smallest part of the energy pyramid. Okay, so the energy pyramid shows us that the most number of organisms are found at the base, and those are mostly your producers. But as you go to the next level of trophic level, the number of population or the number of individuals decreases, as well as the energy being transferred. Now, another thing you have to note is that at every trophic level, energy is lost. Okay, we've established this in the previous video. As these organisms perform their metabolic processes, as they move around, as they hunt, as they respire, as they digest, energy is lost. When they die, energy is lost in that ecosystem. Okay, so it's not destroyed, it's just lost. It's no longer part of an ecosystem. It can be radiated back by the earth back into the atmosphere, or they stay in the ecosystem, but they are not lost. They are no longer included in the cells of the organisms. So here is another example of energy pyramid. So again, this is the definition. An energy pyramid is the graphical representation of the trophic levels by which the incoming solar energy is transferred into an ecosystem. Now, do not forget that for all food chain, for all food web, even for energy pyramid, the source of most energy of all living things on the planet is the sun, right? The sun. And this is just a side note. This is also the reason why most of our ancestors, they have understood this probably. Why the reason why most of our ancestors used to worship the sun, our pagan ancestors, not just here in the Philippines, but in other countries, as in other civilizations as well. Egyptians, Japanese, Greek, Romans, they worship the sun as a god, as a deity, because they have understood the importance of the sun in their ecosystem. That without the sun, they cannot plant crops, they cannot plant their food, and without those food, they will not survive. So that's how important the sun is back in the day, in the modern times, in kickstarting the energy transfer in food chain, food webs, and energy pyramids. So this graphical representation of the energy pyramid gives us an accurate value. So for example, if we start out with 1 million joules, so joules that's a unit of energy in physics. So 1,000 units or 1,000 joules of sunlight the primary producers will be able to store 10,000, only 10,000 of that energy. Okay? Now, once they're eaten by the primary consumers, they transfer this 10,000 joules. But within the body of the primary consumers, oh, is this a bee or a grasshopper? Only 1,000 joules are stored in the body of those grasshoppers. Those are the ones available for transfer to the next trophic level. So consumers, for example, a mouse here. Okay, once that mouse consumes the, what do you call this? What the grasshopper? So only 100 joules are stored in the body of that mouse. Okay, that's the only amount that they can utilize. And then once those mouse or mice are eaten by the tertiary consumers, for example, an eagle or a hawk, only 10% can reach this trophic level. So as you can see, that's why it's called a pyramid. Okay, it's not a rectangle wherein at every trophic level, it's the same amount of energy. No, energy is lost in the process. So as you can see, from one trophic level to another, there's this drastic increase in the amount of energy that can be passed on. Note that the total number of organisms found in any level decreases as one goes up, and only 10% of the stored energy in the organism can be transferred in the next trophic level. So only 10% of the total energy consumed by the plants can be transferred to the primary consumers. Only 10% can be transferred to the next consumer. Only 10% can be transferred to the next consumer, making it a pyramid. As you go higher, the number of organisms decreases and the amount of energy also decreases. So question is, so here another diagram. So light energy, all the plants were able to harvest that. For example, they have 100% of that energy, but only 10% can be transferred to the first level consumer. And out of those 10%, only 10% of that can be transferred to the secondary level or second level consumer. So grasshopper to frogs. Then from those frogs, only 10% of that 1% can be transferred to the third level consumer. So as you go higher, the energy decreases in an energy pyramid. And this is the visualization of the food web, of the food web. So the question is, what happened to the other 90% of energy in each trophic level? What do you think? What did the grasshopper do to the remaining 90,000, for example, of that energy? Okay? On the average, only 9% of the energy, on the average, only 10% is transferred because the remaining 90% is used by the organism for metabolic processes. These organisms are not, heroes who only survive just to be eaten. They also use the energy, the energy that they have caught or harvested or harnessed for their own metabolic processes, for respiration, photosynthesis, and reproduction. So 90% of all the food that the grasshopper eats, 90% of that goes into its own body for growth, for metabolism, for metabolic processes, and for reproduction. Out of all the energy that the frog eats, it uses 90% of that. Only 10% are stored. The 90 in its body. So the 90% are used for swimming, for digestion, for respiration, for reproduction. So the organism uses 80% of its energy. Okay? So the rest are transformed into heat energy before an organism is consumed. So this is that heat loss that we're talking about. So when they die, when they're consumed, heat is lost also in the process. And whenever they perform their life functions, when they move around, they also lose heat in the process. Okay? So the 90% um, is used for metabolic processes. Now, to help you visualize better the energy pyramid, this is a very good video from Amoeba Sisters. I recommend that you watch this video, take down notes, very, very important. Food webs and energy pyramids, bedrocks of biodiversity. Please watch this video. I'll provide the link in the description below. So let's try to this pop quiz. Let's try to label each trophic level appropriately, and then draw and name the examples based from the food pyramid, from the food web that we will be providing. So we'll use this key. Okay. So if this is the food web, how are we going to convert this food web into an energy pyramid? So you might want to pause at this point and take down notes. Okay, you can actually enumerate the different food webs that you can see and try to identify which are the producers, which are the primary consumers, secondary and tertiary consumers. Okay, so you pause this video at this point. So once you're done, let's try to answer. So of course, the base of the pyramid are always your producers. Second part are your primary consumers. Third level are your secondary consumers. Then next level, fourth level, tertiary consumers. Then on the side, all of this will eventually die. So those are your decomposers. How about the organisms? So at the pyramid, at the base of the pyramid or at the producers trophic level, you have the tree. Then the primary consumers, which are always herbivores, are your rabbit, mouse, and goat. Your secondary consumers would be the wild cat, jackal, and snake. And then the top predator or apex predator are your owl, lion, and kite. Nothing eats them anymore. So let's see now, tama ba? Owl, kite, and lion. Nothing eats them anymore. So yes, they are the top or apex predator. So to summarize everything that we've discussed, I also recommend that you watch this video, Inside the Living Cell, How Cells Obtain Energy. This is also in connection to the previous video on photosynthesis and cellular respiration. I'll provide the link in the description below. Let's try and answer this pop quiz. So this is a true or false. So number one, an ecosystem is formed by the interaction of a community of organisms with their physical environment. That's true. Producers provide a source of chemical energy for the organisms to eat them. That's true. The source of energy for living beings on Earth is the sun. That's true. Autotrophs are organisms like plants and algae that can make their own food. That's true. And animals must feed on other organisms to acquire nourishment. That's also true. A consumer is an organism that feeds off decomposing organic material. That's false. We call it decomposers. A lion is an omnivore. False. A lion is a carnivore. Food chains are more complex and interrelated than food webs. It's false. It's the other way around. Food webs are more complex and interrelated than food chains. Water is the primary source of energy in nearly all ecosystems. That's false. It's the sun. And on the average, 50% of the energy is used for life processes. That's false. It's 90%. You can also visit this website, Shepard Software, a game about producers, consumers, and decomposers. Very fun. I'll provide the link in the description below. This one also from Cool Classroom, another interactive game about food chain and food web and energy pyramid. You may play this if you want. Again, linked in the description below. Then this could be the inspiration for your reflective journal log. So it's read as, where are humans located in an energy pyramid? How are we part of that flow of energy in an ecosystem? And how do we impact this flow of energy in our biosphere? I also recommend that you watch this video from Kurgizas entitled Why Are You Alive? Life, Energy, and ATP. If you have understood all our lessons and if you have a brief background on biodiversity as well as evolution, this will really make a huge impact on you. So please, I recommend watch this video. Very, very informative. You will learn a lot. I'll provide the link in the description below. To those who wish to earn extra credit, you can do this concept map. So watch the video food chains compilation. So that will be this video. I'll provide the link in the description below. And so you'll be divided by group, or you can choose just one of the topics here and come up with a concept map. This will be the rubric for your concept map. This will be the video for the inspiration for the concept map. Food chains compilation crash course kids. That ends our video. I hope you learned a lot today. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and like and share this video. Till next time, goodbye.